All right. Hello, bonjour, and welcome, everybody. My name is Milena Audino. I am the Business Information Officer here at the World Trade Centre Winnipeg. I would like to begin today's webinar with our land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we are gathered on the lands of Treaty 1 territory, and that Manitoba is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Innu, Deneslan, and Dakota Oyate nations. We acknowledge we are also on the homelands of the Red River Métis and that northern Manitoba includes lands that were and are the ancestral lands of the Inuit. The World Trade Centre Winnipeg team respects the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledges the harms and mistakes of the past and present throughout our nation. Thank you for joining our webinar, Unlocking Value, Integrating Circularity into Your Supply Chain, which will be presented by Tanis Osterman and Mike Fernandez in partnership with Supply Chain Manitoba. Before we begin, I want to share a few housekeeping items. So number one, please send all of your webinar questions directly in the chat box at the top of your screen, and they will try to answer as many as they can during the session, and we are also having a Q&A session at the end. For all logistical questions, please send them directly to the chat box, and I will answer your questions as soon as I can. And lastly, you will also receive a PDF copy and recording of this presentation within the next week. So now it's time to start our webinar. I would like to introduce you to Tanis and Mike. So Tanis Osterman is principal and founder of Can Sustain, a Manitoba firm specializing in environmental and sustainability management issues and solutions. She has worked in the fields of environmental and sustainability management, system development, and improvement for 25 years, having led the design, facilitation, and development of sustainability-focused projects. Mike Fernandez is principal and owner of Strategy Makers Consulting, Inc., providing strategic advisory and project management support services in environmental sustainability and organizational strategy, management, and leadership to nonprofit organizations, as well as small and medium-sized businesses. He has over 30 years of experience in a wide range of sectors, both in Manitoba and across Canada. So please welcome Tanis and Mike. The floor is all yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I guess it's afternoon. My name is Mike Fernandez. Thanks, Milena, for that lovely introduction. Thanks, World Trade Center, for having us. And thanks all of you for attending. I know you're taking time out of your busy day, and hopefully you're having a sandwich and relaxing and doing a little bit of learning in between your busy day. So we're here with you today as part of a project that is being led by Supply Chain Manitoba. With also participation from the Saskatchewan Institute of Supply Chain Canada, with funding from Prairies Can and from a little bit from the Manitoba government as well through the Sector Council program. And the purpose of the project is to increase the adoption of circularity principles and practices within supply chains of medium, small-sized businesses, and through engagement, development of tools, resources, and training materials. That's quite a mouthful, but basically it's the project is intended to start getting Manitoba and Saskatchewan businesses thinking and preparing for this transition to what's called a circular economy. So that's what we're here to talk to you about today. Over the past 18 months or so, my colleague Tanis and her partners in Can Sustain have been gathering information about circular economy from leading sources around the world and trying to put together a set of tools and resources that are aimed specifically to Manitoba and Saskatchewan businesses to help you understand what is this whole thing about circular economy? What are the principles and practices, and how does it affect my business, or how will it affect my business, and how do I use it and think about this strategically? We've also had a number of focus groups and roundtable sessions in Manitoba and Saskatchewan over the last about year to get feedback as we go. So I'll tell you a little more about the project at the end and how we're hoping that you'll participate as we go forward. But in the meantime, we're excited to share with you where we're at to date with the work. And the content that you're going to hear today is based on the research and also the discussions we've had with businesses to date. So Our objectives today are to provide you with foundational information on circular economy, principles and practices that'll help you innovate and grow your business. There is a focus on supply chains and circularity practices about supply chains to help you become more competitive, resilient, and productive. And then we also want to, like I said, invite you to take advantage of the information and tools we're developing so that you can be more strategic about this, because the circular economy is an emerging trend. It's all over the world, and it does impact businesses as well. So before we get into the technical stuff, and I invite Tanis to take the screen here, I'm going to take a brief moment just to walk you through a broad overview of circular economy, how it relates to environmental sustainability, and why understanding and shifting to circularity is a strategic imperative and an opportunity for you. So, Tanis, you're advancing my slides. Thank you for that. I find the easiest way to think about circular economy is to start by contrasting against what is the linear economy. And the linear economy is something that's kind of evolved over, let's say the last 100 years, especially in around the globe. And it's very basic. It's basically where we have this view or this lens of business and economy and economic activity where we take resources from the earth, so forestry resources, logging, trees, oil, energy, fossil fuels, minerals. We apply all kinds of human power, whether it's labor or brain power. We apply lots of investment in dollars and money and energy, and we use it to make things out of those resources. But then when we're done, and this done can mean, like for packaging, it means as soon as you open the product you want, throw away the package, or it can mean things like a car, which lasts for hopefully 10, 15 years. Appliances last 10, 15 years, maybe less these days. Buildings, bridges that last much longer. But at some point when we're done with those things, or we think we're done with them, we have tended to throw them away as waste or discard them as waste, generally. Okay, so take from the earth, make things out, and then when we feel we're done, we throw it out as waste. Now, this is a picture of a landfill in Manitoba. If you go back, sometimes that waste is managed very well, and it's covered with grass, and it looks really nice, and it becomes a little hill and a dog park and those kinds of things. Other times it's not, right? So this is kind of the traditional view, or the view of our economy that's linear. Now, I want you to take a second here to think about the different materials that your business or your organization buys, uses, and then discards or sends away with your customer. Think about where those materials come from, how they're extracted, how they're transported, what types of energy, water, and other inputs are used across your entire supply chain, and then what wastes or residuals are generated along the way. It's a lot of stuff, right? Now, think about every business and every organization, all the economic activity around the world, and you can start to appreciate that this take, make, waste is not sustainable. And Tanis, you can go to the next slide. It does two things. It depletes our natural resources at the front end, and it reduces our planet's capacity to sustain life at the back end as well, with the waste. It's just the way it is. I'm not bringing this up to kind of highlight all these environmental problems, because we all know what they are, and we see them, and we kind of observe them as we go. We live them because we're humans who live on Earth. So we need to change how we think about this, from take, make, waste to something different. And it's a big deal. Tanis, you can kind of go on here. For those of you who are into climate, or who really think about climate change and how that impacts life, using resources and energy and materials in our economy, the total greenhouse gas emissions across the globe, 55% of them are from energy and 45% are for products. So you can see that if there's any waste in this, we're creating unnecessary greenhouse gas emissions. This isn't about necessarily just reducing economic activity. It's about reducing waste from economic activity, right? So that's where these are unnecessary greenhouse gas emissions. Pretty big deal. Keep going, Tanis. $25 trillion of global materials pass back and forth across borders around our world. Only less or about 7% of that material is used in any secondary use, so brought back into the economy and used again in any fashion. So that means 93% of the material goods that go through our economy in a year are take, make, and then wasted. So that's a lot, right? That's not only lost or impact on the environment, but there's a big wasted opportunity in dollars here globally. So, I'll just let you look at those numbers. And then the final thing on the global scale that we want to talk about here is that, and I'm going to work backwards from this. So 28%. So we know that consumption of materials and energy continues to grow each year. Less of it is being reused at this point, just because of the more of it's being in that take, make, waste still, and so circular economy is becoming a really big part of the discussion. How do we stop taking, making, wasting, and bring materials back in and waste less from our process? So that's the big picture stuff. You can go to the next one, Tanis. This is a really important thing for Manitoba and Saskatchewan businesses as well. And so, so the global picture is important. Obviously, it affects all of us, but as a business owner, which I am as well, and so is Tanis, it's a real strategic issue for us in our businesses. We all have a collective interest in seeing business thrive here in our provinces and in the prairies. This is a strategic issue. And this is the main point I want to make, is that it's easy to start thinking of some of these things as just another environmental sustainability thing, or just another how do I recycle more thing. It's not. You have to throw this through your business strategy lens and start to think about, what does this circular economy mean in terms of imperatives and things I got to do, but also opportunity. And here's just a couple of reasons why. We talked about the global demand for resources is growing. That means that costs are going to rise. There's going to be more and more demand for resources, materials, and land. I think we're at a population of about 8 billion across the world, quickly getting to 9 billion. So there's going to be more resources that people are chasing. There's political pressures and public pressure to do more about the environment. None of us want to live next to a polluted site. Sometimes we forget that, but I work in the field I work in, where you're talking about waste management and landfills a lot. As soon as you talk about somebody next door or a field that's being put to a use that's a little bit lower on the environmental scale and the risk is there, people all of a sudden pay attention. So public and political pressure to do something is growing. Our consumers are demanding it. You may have heard it in your business that people want you to do something about the environment, and they expect that of our businesses. Investors, for those of you who have investors, you're starting to see all this stuff playing out in your investor statements, kinds of things. Regulations for businesses, especially if you export. Like if you're, for example, if you're sending packaged material or packaged goods to Europe, by 2030, you're going to have to meet certain circular economy standards, including recycled content and that kind of stuff. And then there's risk and liability. I don't know if you've noticed it, but in my insurance, my professional insurance, you start to see the words like climate and environment and pollution. And, we're starting to see the insurers and underwriters getting really concerned about the impacts of climate, the impacts of environmental degradation, and the risk to business. So this is pretty important. The other piece is, of course, even the companies that don't want to do something or are being reluctant, we live in a competitive marketplace. And if our competitors are innovating and becoming more sustainable and dealing with this circular economy stuff, it's going to impact us. We're seeing this a lot in the fossil fuel sector for sure. There's some old guard companies, of course, that people always say they're very reluctant. They don't want to do anything, but they are starting to be pushed, not necessarily by the investor who might want to make more profit, but their competitors are doing it and innovating. So this is an impact to businesses as well. So bottom line, please, as you're listening to Tanis's presentation, think about, how is this a strategic issue, an opportunity for my business? Because that's the critical piece that I think through your business lens you got to think about. Thing I'll say is, before we move to Tanis, I think it's important to also acknowledge to you that the information that's being presented today and the tools that we're developing in this project, they're intended for a very diverse audience. each of you has a unique business and circumstances. This is foundational knowledge, and it's intended to help you, a broad range of businesses and industries, understand this stuff. So I want you to take it, listen to it, think about how it applies to your business, but this isn't going to be a magic template. This isn't going to be a game plan that's specific to your business. Run it through your business lens, run it through your business thinking. Here's what I learned today. What does it mean for my business, and how do I start to prepare? So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for your attention. And Tanis, thanks for your patience. This is Tanis Osterman, and she's going to walk you through the content that they've been developing as part of this project. Take it away.
Thanks, Mike. Welcome, everybody. Obviously, we really prefer to be doing this in person, as we usually do. Harder for us to scrap like brother and sister, as it's been called, when we're virtual, but we'll get through this. So the remainder of the presentation is based on the content that we've been developing as this project. And so what you're going to be seeing is a very truncated and, talking head version of that information. The actual tool, which as of right now we're calling it the body of knowledge that will be released, is quite comprehensive, and we're hitting on the highlights here. That is to whet your appetite. Part of it is just to start socializing all business-minded and policy-minded people to the idea, because it is coming, and it is a tough one. It's a really big concept, but as I have told many people, if you can get your head around climate change, then getting your head around circularity is going to be no problem. So let's start with some of the basics. So the first of that, Mike went through a very good description and introduction to what circularity is, but for those of us that need like the point form and the graphics, which is me, I want to present that to you. This is a very heavy text deck, and that's because we know you're going to be getting it afterwards, and we want to give you some material to chew on when you're done here. But if you need a definition, a circular economy is one that produces and uses goods while making sure there's no waste or pollution throughout the entire chain. We want to make sure materials and energy are continually used and reused at the highest possible value. And we want to make sure that wherever possible, systems are mimicked, protected, and regenerated. So we call that circular economy. That's obviously something at the economic or society level. When we're talking about it within a closed system like a company, we just change the verb tense. We say circularity or circular. So what it also means is that we're focusing on the value of materials in the market and not on the value of materials in production. So that's one of the biggest differences. So we talk commodity pricing, we're talking materials in production, which drives everything else. And we want to shift some of that thinking to materials in the market. What has already been dug up? What's available? How can we take what we access and what we put into the market as a company, reclaim some of that value, and then recycle it again? The definition I gave you previously contains 3 primary principles. It doesn't matter which think tank or which government or which group of people you're talking about regarding circularity. These 3 principles have to hold. If they don't hold, we are not talking about circularity. So those principles are: you want to eliminate waste and pollution. We want to circulate products and materials at their highest values, and we want to regenerate nature. Not every organization that engages in circularity can hit all of these evenly, but every single principle is incorporated in the thought process every single time. Again, for people that like the graphic and the linear display of things, of which I am one, this is your example of a very simple linear economy. This would encompass most manufacturing or widget companies. With circular, all we're doing is we're adding loops in the material flow. So every organization will have its own loops and what serves them best. In general, the smaller the loop, the better. The more value you're hanging on to, if it's regardless of whether it's material or energy. If we were in person, I would start pointing to this, but you're just going to have to take my word for it. If you follow the loops, the smaller ones are the most beneficial. They're the ones that really dial that in. But overall, the more loops that you can add to the way that your materials and energy are handled, the more your operation becomes. Now we've talked about what it is. Let's move into some of these circular business models. So this is more how it applies at the business level. We haven't yet gotten into supply chain focus, but we will be able to relate that back a little bit later. There are 5 business models. And you may see them used in different languages, but when we consolidate all the other options, everything amounts to these major models. So use of circular inputs, resource recovery and recycling, product life extension, asset sharing, and product or performance as a service, sometimes called XaaS. And we'll go through each one of those and you can get a little bit more on what it is about. So when we're talking about the use of circular inputs, before I start on this, I'll go back. I just want to say that as we go through this, absolutely there will be overlap between these definitions and examples. And in any one company, it would be very rare for them to be able to incorporate all 5 models. They might have 1, they might have 2, they might have a little bit of 3. They might take a little bit of each of them and add them to their processes where applicable. So that's okay. These are not hard and fast rules. It's just a way to start categorizing the conversation and our action plans. So use of circular inputs. This is where the products, materials, and resources that we need are designed and produced and used and repurposed in a continuous cycle. So some of the examples of activities that might happen in shop when you're talking about use of circular inputs would be sustainable sourcing and procurement. We're going to incorporate circular product design, reverse logistics. So that means bringing back the product into the shop. And it might also include remanufacturing and refurbishing. Then there's resource recovery and recycling. So very closely related to the previous one, but this is where we're collecting and reusing or recycling valuable materials or energy. So some of the stuff that we're going to have to undertake when we want to incorporate this business model is waste audits, collection and sorting of waste. And so that could be either in shop, or that could be just making sure that data is available from other sources of the high value waste or secondary products that you want to use. We can reuse and recycle products and materials, and there's also modifying material specifications. So as an example, instead of virgin aluminum, can we use, a percentage of recycled aluminum? That is also part of the resource recovery and recycling strategy. Product life extension. These are processes that prolong the period of usefulness of the products that we're talking about. So in that, we might design for durability. That's a very specific engineering process, and it requires a whole bunch of inputs and a whole lot of rigor. Providing maintenance services, we could remanufacture and refurbishing. So you may have noticed that we also had remanufacturing and refurbishing for the circular inputs. That's good. Like I said, there's a lot of crossover here, and that's good. That's reinforcing. Upgrades so that your product is not rendered obsolete and you can continue to use it, and also modular design. All of these contribute to product life extension, and in your own shop or within your own value chain, no doubt you will find other examples of this. Asset sharing. So this is the formation of partnerships between organizations to share resources such as equipment, work sites, materials, and it's also inclusive of the platforms that facilitates this. So there have been many studies of what asset sharing can look like, and in current and projected success of what asset sharing works the best, it's always the ones that can be facilitated through digitization. So as an example, digital passports, shared websites where we can check things in and check things out, almost like a library. So in most cases, if we're going to reorient a business model for asset sharing, you do need to have the accompanying digitization to support that. But just some very basic examples, you can create partnerships with companies that need similar equipment or tools. You can co-locate with organizations to share warehouse space and office space. So co-locating for sharing warehouse space has been very common for a very long time. Office space, we've seen that like crazy since everybody started coming back from COVID. But there's also collaborative R&D efforts, especially in non-competitive spaces, where we can just, we're sharing either the physical facility in which the different R&D activities take place, or we might be sharing risk and benefits from the same R&D processes. And then product or performance as a service, or XaaS. This is where access and performance are offered to customers, but without the option of ownership. So this is when a company might guarantee access to a piece of equipment or a product when needed without offering ownership. So it might be something like a lease. That would be a very basic example, but another example would be, as an example, you pay just like a subscription service. So if you need an industrial size compressor, you're not necessarily paying for a brand new compressor every 5 to 15 years. You pay for a subscription, and somebody comes in and they are ensuring that that thing works as good as it's supposed to every 6 months or 12 months. And then they're the ones that say, you know what, next 6 months, we're going to give you a new one because we're guaranteeing the performance of that. And I've covered that subscription bit here in the second point on this slide. So those are the business models. That's the foundations of circularity. Now we're going to move into supply chain circularity. So I want to preface this just by reiterating what Mike said. This is a supply chain focused exercise. The project owners here are Supply Chain Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and that the funding that has been supported through PrairieScan is focused on supply chain. So that's what you're seeing here. If you say, well, how come we haven't talked about durable design? Okay, well, that's not as closely related to supply chain circularity as we want. So that's why you might have some questions about scope. It doesn't mean that we can't answer those questions for you, but what you're going to be seeing today is very focused on supply chain. The first thing we have to talk about is the interactions between supply chain and the circular economy. It's important to note that the low-hanging fruit for most policy changes, for most organizations, and essentially consumers from the business to consumer relationship is through supply chain. So the supply chain professionals and the function in a company, they are usually the first point of contact and authority for what substitutions might be available, for specifying what a supplier must or must not do. The supply chain people usually have access to a much bigger network because you've got everybody clamoring to come in your door and offer you new products and services. Supply chain people and that function has an experience in cultivating beneficial relationships to make sure that they're getting the best deal, whatever best means for that company. As I mentioned, it's also where the lowest hanging fruit is for supply chain actions right off the hop. The supply chain function also, if they don't already own traceability and chain of custody, they definitely have the most experience with it, even in high quality control environments. They also own logistics, both outgoing and then reverse logistics. And there is a very strong body of knowledge within the supply chain professional group and within the function about how to leverage these relationships and how to engage in proper procurement, transportation, and warehousing. Mike said it at the beginning, but I just want to reiterate it now, and we'll mention it again later, is that we consider supply chain for the purposes of this project to be sourcing and procurement, transportation, and warehousing. And so we've covered off all of these in this presentation. All right. So we talked about the supply chain function, but there's two specific ways supply chain professionals can actually lead the charge on this. So the first is that you can apply a circular mindset to every single supply chain function that you look at, touch, breathe on, sneeze on, whatever. Every time you're doing your job, you apply that circular mindset once you get into the rhythm of it, and you will see the benefits, and you will see that many of the things you need to do can be done inexpensively and without a lot of complexity. The second thing that you can do, considering the critical nature of a supply chain professional in the company, is to support every other function to make sure their circularity dreams come true. So I talked about how the scope of this project is restricted to supply chain, but if you get into engineering and they're designing for durability or modularity and they need different materials or they need different access to suppliers, who are they going to come to? They're going to come to the supply chain people for the most part. So now we're moving into the strategies that we might use to implement some of these practices, these circular practices within the supply chain. So we're going to go through this by function in the organization, and we've mixed up the direct and the supporting, but the point is just to give you some examples. So in operations, you might be supporting a take back program. So what that means is the final product goes out to consumer, like whether it's through a distribution channel, whether it's through storefronts, whether it's, online ordering, whatever. But you create programs where the consumers have easy access to get that product back to you. When we talk about the value of circularity, one of the ways value is classified is through informational value. And the informational value of getting that product back to assess how consumers have used it, what the lifespan actually was, is there materials that can be salvaged to funnel back through your production process? Even though it's hard to quantify, it has been deemed to be one of the highest value streams within the circularity loops. There's also waste marketing within the operations. To use a very good luck making this happen now, but 20 years ago, if you had cut off copper, right? If you had stuff you didn't need, it was very easy to sell that as a waste product. I mean, now instead of having waste, people are stealing it off your property, but same idea. Most industrial sites have some sort of waste product that somebody else in a different value chain need as an input. The gap is trying to put those things together, but that market capacity is there. There's also spares optimization. So previous to COVID, we said just-in-time inventory was like the best, and I think we've all agreed it's not the best, but there is still this concept of spares optimization. So if you know from an asset management perspective, what's going to go first, having that spare in place cuts down on the emergency ordering, which can reduce the supply lines, reduce the distance of shipping. And then customer engagement is another thing that happens in the operations. So redesigning customer specifications and expectations. As an example that I used previously, do we actually need virgin aluminum or can we use recycled aluminum? You have to talk to your customer about that. And then we get into the sourcing and procurement functions. So designing procurement specifications. So even if you can't get circular products, socializing your suppliers by saying, tell us what you do in your shop for waste. Tell us if you take back the packaging of the stuff you give us. That goes into procurement specifications. Directly related to that is evaluating suppliers for how much they're willing to play ball with you. Asking for and testing out alternatives and substitutions, engaging in product and material traceability. We talked about that. So digital passports, and this is not like, it's not you developing these technologies. These technologies are very, very well developed. They're being used at national levels. It's just taking advantage of them. And also seeking out opportunities where you can get performance as a service instead of needing to buy an asset. I know that's hard because sometimes our capitalization budgets are easier to deal with than our operating budgets. And so that's creative accounting. And logistics, you can look for shipping efficiencies like what's the neighbor next door shipping? Can we just hop on board on that truck? Can they hop on board on our truck? And then last mile considerations. This is a very big deal whose primary method to get to the consumer is through online ordering, is how they can get to those major centers and then just radiate out. Facilities and infrastructure, we might consider fractional warehousing. Talked about that. It's very common, has been for a long time. But what about co-location? If you found a company or a group of companies whose output was beneficial to you as an input, chances are you'd want to settle next to them. It's sort of the same idea as, putting a McDonald's right beside an elementary school. That co-location is a very strategic way to address things if you're having to expand. And then also shared asset ownership. We always use the example, if a factory's annual shutdown is over a 2-week period, but then after that they don't use all the equipment for that maintenance, can they share that maintenance equipment with the neighbor and just reschedule their 2-week shutdown at a different time? People say that's difficult. I think anything that's human created is probably some of the easiest things to fix. We're talking about change. And then partnerships. So this is a very strategic approach to things, but making sure you have the right supplier partnerships, like have suppliers that walk up to you and say, hey, try this. Hey, guess what? We're doing this. Hey, can we try this in your shop at a reduced cost? Also sector alignments and buying groups. That's a big deal. We live in a province where we don't usually have a lot of opportunity to influence the large multinational supply chains. But if we come together, we can sometimes get that market value to do that. And then also the playground. So the playground is where you test out different things in a low risk environment. You set sometimes it's a physical space, sometimes it's just a R&D space, sometimes it's more of an administrative space to try things and see what works for you and your consumers. Okay, we have talked about why circularity is important. We talked about the basics of circularity. We then went into the business models and we talked about the link with supply chain. And so now talk about some of the things that make circularity in the supply chain real and awesome and fantastic. And we're also going to talk about some of the things that make it super hard. And not surprising to anybody, these are usually just two sides of the same coins. So when we talk about enablers, these are the things that determine the success of a circular economy and adoption of the circular practices. So most organizations are really going to need to drill down what they are, what these enablers are, how the enablers affect their business, and what they can influence among those enablers. Last bit is the most important, knowing what you can influence, just like anything else strategically that you're going to approach, making sure you're wasting your time on things that you can't control. So what you see here is the list of enabling factors. This is in our body of knowledge. As I said, we're pulling out some of the short form gems, and then each of these are much more comprehensive in the foundational document. These we didn't just guess at these. So the literature tells us, experience in other jurisdictions tells us, some of the biggest and most respected circularity think tanks. We've condensed all of that into this list. So when we talk about making sure that you understand what you can influence, you want to take 10 minutes and go through each of these and say, how much influence do we have? So within the sphere of a supply chain, you might say, yeah, we got a decent amount of influence over the culture and executive buy-in. Oh, yeah, we can't touch policy and regulatory. That's not us. Yep, turns out that we don't control, own, or do anything about publicly used materials and waste management infrastructure. We have huge influence over awareness and understanding among our employees and supplier network. We also have tremendous influence over developing networks that can add to our circularity strength. We don't have a lot of influence over customer pull, like maybe, the occasional conversation, but for the most part, you are responding to what they want, not telling them what they want. You might have limited access to circular materials, technologies, and infrastructure. And like most things that we're talking about in this presentation, there is interchange between all of these enablers. Like the stronger your network, the more access to circular materials and technologies you will have. The greater the socialization and awareness of circularity among your suppliers, the more access to circular materials and technologies you will have. You might have minimal access to quality data to start determining how to make this work. The supply chain influence, as in, can I put a mandate out that my supplier shall provide circular materials? As a single company, you might not. If you leverage a buying group, then probably. You might have limited access to capital to put any circular strategies in place, but you do have a certain level of influence over how supply chain functions and circularity are incorporated into strategic planning and risk. So I've gone through this at breakneck speed. As mentioned early on, you will get a copy of this deck with this list, but this would be sort of your first or second step. Like, what of this can we control? And then obviously we have to go and talk about challenges, because once you've identified your enablers, you want to make sure you know what you're getting into so you can kind of break down those barriers before they become something you can't overcome. So these are the factors and circumstances that can prevent or limit the adoption of circular practices. When we're assessing the readiness of an organization, they need to understand what challenges they have to be faced with, as I said, so that they can really grab onto the enablers and make sure that they're functioning optimally. And because I'm an optimist, we see challenges or the opportunities, but I'm going to give them to you in 3 different categories. And again, these are not things we just made up. This is the stuff that when you look at the world of circularity, these are the common challenges that governments, organizations, and consumers have identified. And we've done our best to sort of categorize them and make them into a nice, neat list. So under the category of cultural governance, transactional versus strategic. So there's a lot of companies, especially small ones, where supply chain is just a very transactional activity. We want to raise it to the level of strategic. There is a social bias against anything that's not new. We have to get rid of that. And there's also inertia. Anybody that's tried to get a 65-year-old business owner to change anything when that 65 business owner is looking to sell, not happening. That's inertia. And then data and information. Without proper data, it's tough to prove profitability. We have limited awareness and information. The lack of data for our actual operating needs can be unavailable or of a low quality, and also information about access to alternative materials. Then we move on to what those external forces are for challenges. And so scaling, that can be tough. Distance, especially in Canada, our low density of companies and people, as well as our distance, are our biggest external limitations. It's not even the cold weather. It's more distance. We might not have the infrastructure we need, product tolerances or strict specifications that are either regulated or provided by our customers. Regeneration of nature, you'll remember that's one of the 3 principles. Companies on their own generally cannot have large contributions to regeneration of nature. That usually has to be at a civic or national level. You might be facing limited demand for circular products. Cost and financing, that's going to be tough. either understanding, dealing with the cost, or getting financing to accommodate, and also lack of policies, standards, and frameworks that can be troublesome. However, the left hand, if we consider that all the internal things, if we work on those, then we will be ready for when those external forces change, which they will. There is evidence all over that those external forces are starting to change. I want to give you some function-specific examples. I realize we've got 15-ish left in this session. Melanie, I think if you could just confirm that, I'll continue to buzz through here. So as a reminder, we're talking sourcing and procurement, transportation and warehousing. So some specific things and examples for circular sourcing and procurement. We want to secure the inputs that are used, repurposed. By the way, we want to verify, just because somebody says it's recycled, it doesn't mean it is. Get whatever their chain of custody or their assurance or their guarantee is on paper. Durable materials, that includes service agreements. Ideally, we'd get modular. Anything that's low waste, low emission, low water, etc. for inputs. Again, have people verify that. We want to promote and seek opportunities for asset sharing. Hey, I'm only using this 20% of the time. Does anybody else want to use the other 20%? We want to source locally wherever we can, because anything that part of the loop is reducing the distance that materials have to travel. So anytime we can do something locally, that does add resilience to our supply chain. We want to experiment. That gets back to that shared R&D capacity or the playground with different products or service alternatives. We want to tighten those procurement specifications. I will continue to go back to the aluminum example. Do we actually need virgin metals for what we're doing? Most don't, like aerospace for sure, but even they're starting to research, can we move slightly away from virgin materials? And then leveraging those group buying platforms. So that's what the circular sourcing and procurement function can do. In most SMEs, all this stuff is combined, these functions, but this is especially notable for people where those functions are split out. And when we're talking about
sorry to interrupt, Dennis.
Yes.
Just about 8 minutes, and then we will move on to the Q&A. But there is a question for you in the chat. So
I
think it
can't
was
see
just
the chat.
Okay, yeah. So we have Victor who's asking, how would distance challenge change in Canada?
So I'm going to take that as, how is distance in Canada a problem versus in other nations? And Victor, if I've interpreted that, you can just correct that chat and we can talk about it after. So because our centers, our industrial centers and our consumer centers are so far apart, that sometimes the cost to move product, like on a reverse logistics basis, as an example, is tougher. Say if you lived in a country where every center was the size of like the GTA, and there was regular transportation going between all centers. So one of the reasons Europe is so far ahead of us on this, and some of the more dense places in like Africa, even some places in the States and South America, is because of the density of their industrial centers and their people. There's already people and vehicles and movement of knowledge back and forth between these places. And here it just becomes a little difficult. Even our closest center by industry base, by population, and sort of by culture, like Saskatoon, even then, it's harder to get that back and forth very quickly. I'll carry on. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So when we're talking,
actually, I'm so sorry. He just added, you mentioned that if we improve our internal challenges, the external ones would improve, but distances is part of the external list of challenges. I just don't see how that could be improved.
Yes, sorry. So I did misunderstand your question then. So an example would be if you elevate supply chain and circularity thinking to a strategic level versus a transactional level, you will start to plan around or in consideration of those distances like you may not have before. It's not that the distance itself is going to change, it's that the ability to manage that distance becomes easier when you control the internal stuff that goes along with it. The other part is there are efforts being made to do things like, are there depots that can sort of transect that distance, those distances? So as you know, maybe we're not dealing just Winnipeg to Saskatoon, maybe we're talking Winnipeg to Depot 1, Depot 2, Depot 3, right? Just kind of like the Amazon model. So there is discussion of that. No, the distances geographically will not change. The ability to traverse them, even in a changing climate, it's going to be easier for us to get to the north, but the ability to traverse them. And the activity that happens between those centers, that's what will start to change. And we want to make sure we're ready to accommodate that and take advantage of those. Or alternatively, deal with things if the distances that we used to be able to traverse cannot be traversed anymore.
I'll type. I'm going to let you keep going, Tanis, but Victor, I'll use an example later in our presentation, maybe that can talk a little bit to that as well. Sorry, my chat function's not working. I don't know what I did, but yeah, Victor, I'll try and address it a little bit in a second after Tanis is done.
So circular transportation route. This is pretty common because for transportation companies, it's very easy for them to equate a closed loop, so less miles, with savings on fuel. So none of this is really new. So route optimization, load collaboration, packaging optimization, like load it in there so there's no air pockets. Sustainable vehicle use. This should also include fuel use, reverse logistics, ensuring you've got backhaul, and driver training, which was a new one to me. Apparently, there is a significant emissions reduction if we can get drivers doing what they need to do properly. And incorporation of telematics, so that's GIS. Warehousing, a little bit of a smaller list. We can make sure we've got inventory management, as in, do we have the spares we need, or are we taking up space with stuff that's not going to get used, once every 10 years? A designated area for return products. I have been in warehouses where they say the only limitation to accepting returned products is the space in the warehouse. We can do this. Sharing a warehouse space, very common. Energy efficiency measures, again, very common because we've generally got a single source of heat, cooling, and lighting. Local warehousing, the fewer miles, the better. And reuse of packaging and shipping materials. So breakneck speed. I want to cover a couple of examples of local and familiar companies, just so that we can see how this might look. So while we're coming to an end on the supply chain, I'm going to elevate the scope of this again to talk at the corporate level, because now the examples you're going to see, it might not be, their use of circularity might not be within the supply chain function. So Botanical Paperworks, this is a Winnipeg company. They use seeds as an input to their paper so that when you throw the paper out or when you're done with it, it will grow, it will germinate. So we can qualify that under the circular inputs business model. Barnes & Duncan, another Winnipeg company, they have a software program. I think it's called TownSuite, yes. And so that can be qualified as a performance as a service. They manage that software. It's for asset management at the municipal level and at the equipment level to extend the lifespan or better plan out asset work. IKEA. So interesting, IKEA and Apple in the same 2 years were told by the US, I think the Securities Exchange Commission, that they are going to support consumers in repairing their products. So IKEA has, they like to say they committed to making sure there's a repair manual for every single one of their products by 2030. That's product life extension. Let's just not give them too much grace. They were forced to do that. By the way, this list is not an endorsement of any of these companies. It's just examples. Home Depot, this is pretty common. If I need a table saw and I need it once a year, I'm going to go and rent one from the Home Depot. I am sharing that asset. Obviously, Home Depot did not get into equipment rentals because it was environmentally good for them to do so. They did it because that was the best business model for them. Oops, sorry. Peg City Car Co-op, another example of asset sharing. For those of you that are unfamiliar with this, Peg City Car Co-op is the owner of the asset, and then people who need cars sign them out and access those. So you get fewer things on the road and more people using those things. Standard Aero, another Winnipeg company with 100+ year successful life. Their entire business model is based on remanufacturing, product life extension. Again, they did not go into this because this is environmentally friendly. They went into this because that was the best business model for them. And then New Flyer, as exemplified just by the most recent Prairies Can announcement with them, the use of circular inputs. So that would be the designing products that can use non-hazardous and less greenhouse gas generating inputs to power their equipment. Okay, where are we? Oh, right. Sorry. And Gerdau. So Gerdau used to be called the Selkirk Rolling Mills, still in Selkirk, just now owned by, I think, a Brazilian company. But that's an example of resource recovery and recycling. So, when we're pulling, Mike, it's unfortunately cut from this presentation just because of time, but when we're pulling old fridges and old cars from landfills or bringing them down south from being stranded up north, they're going to Gerdau and they're being used as an input for something else. So I wanted to show these examples to show just how common circularity is for companies. This is not some like new age kumbaya kind of a thing. This is the way a lot of companies, whether they've been directed to, they wouldn't have done so if they couldn't have adjusted their margins on the up. But these are companies where this is the best way for them to do business. They're fulfilling their mission, they're making money, they're successful. Okay, Mike, you want to take over?
Yes, for sure. Okay, and I'll be very quick here. The only thing I'm going to say before we open it up to questions is that today's presentation in we've asked Tanis a pretty big challenge, take 300 pages of content and teach it to people in 45 minutes or less. So, take this as an introduction to this whole concept and to the thinking you need to take forward in what you do. So, there's a couple of things. This presentation is a summary of the body of knowledge that Tanis is putting together. It's going to be a web-based at some point, module-based thing that we're trying to get together for Supply Chain Manitoba. So you will be able to step in and look at different pieces of the puzzle as we go. We're going to continue doing the testing and refinement of this over the next 6 months, but we're hoping by March 2025 that we will have that ready for business owners to really dig into the parts that make sense to them. At this point, the presentation today, I think, is more about, okay, here's all the different things you can think about to help you understand circular economy. I think Victor's question, yeah, there's some things you're not going to change. Distance is distance, but you got to look at that and say, okay, well, my challenge is distance. That's not changing. How do I start looking at it? And I'm going to give you a very simple example. In construction sector here in Manitoba, virgin aggregate, so limestone crushed rock, is becoming more and more costly to access. And there's signs that it might be less and less of it that's available. So can't do you're going to have to go further and further to get your virgin rock. Well, guess what? You got to start thinking of alternatives. Maybe you start looking at using recycled glass. Maybe you look at recycled concrete aggregate. Maybe you look at recycled tires and tire derived aggregate. So you start to use the circular economy thinking to address a challenge and, again, strategic, pinpoint, right? So that's what we're going to be doing over the next little while, 6 months. And in the meantime, there is a survey that we also want to get input from businesses. And the WTC team has agreed they're going to send that out to you. And we hope, please do participate in that survey. We need input on these things so that we can refine what we're doing and keep making sure that these tools and this information is accessible and workable for you. Like, what particular pieces. So that's it. That's our call to action for today. But in the meantime, are there any questions? My chat wasn't working. So was there any questions that people have? I think we have a few minutes here.
There were no other questions in the chat, but I don't know if maybe someone wants to unmute themselves or had a question. All right, I think it was super detailed, your presentation. No one has that many questions then.
Yeah, there's definitely lots of information and lots to think through. And again, the good news is that this is not going to happen overnight. These are just the direction of the world and the opportunity for you as business owners. And hey, I know there's some government folks on the call here too, looking at it from the other side and procurement of business services, right? So that's something important too as you read through this stuff, is how do we address our procurement part of this to make sure we're helping Manitoba businesses thrive in this new circular economy. So yeah, lots to do. Please let the WTC team know that if you're interested and follow up, call Tanis or I if you have any questions, and then we'll do our best to answer them. I know each sector, I just saw something about the food processing. Each sector of our economy is looking at this as well. So the manufacturer sector, the food and beverage of Manitoba, like all these different groups are looking at what does all this general stuff mean for our sector and our industry. So there's going to be lots of stuff coming out over the next little while. Thanks for listening. Tanis, you can say thank you as well. I really appreciate it, and we appreciate your input, and we look forward to continuing this discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, and to World Trade Center for having us, and for all of you for joining in. Further to Mike's call to action or reference to our policy maker friends on this call, there have been, some pretty strong opinions and informed opinions that governments changing their procurement strategies could be the single biggest driver for industry adoption of circular practices. Because it doesn't matter whether we're selling to government, someone else in our supply chain who has control over what we're doing, they are gearing their entire procurement strategy to emulate what the government does. And I realize the province is emulating the feds, but this province in particular, there's a lot that can be done with procurement, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cost taxpayers more money. And I would like to leave you with that. I don't know if there's anybody still on the call, but knowing this is recorded, I want to get that out there. Thank you very much, everybody.
No, thank you so much, Tanis and Mike, for delivering this insightful presentation. And as you can see, they do have their emails here. So if you have any questions, you could also send them an email. And I also included a few webinars and events that we are holding in the next few weeks, just in the chat box. So make sure to check that out. But thank you, everyone who came, and we will hopefully see you soon.
Thank you.
Everyone have a good day.
Thank you.